You come to me asking for a favor, but you do it without respect. You probably recognize that famous line from Don Corleone in The Godfather. And along with it, you probably picture the entire mafia aesthetic. Guys in double-breasted suits with pocket squares, felt hats pulled low, Tommy guns in their hands, beautiful women at their sides, whiskey on the tables, and that wild party atmosphere where everyone somehow ends up shooting each other, mixed with luxury, power, and show business. That image is what most people imagine when they hear the word mafia. But that's not what we're really talking about today. Today, we're talking about the real mafia, organizations that have been developing for almost 2 centuries. And all those stories about secret governments, shadow elites, and global conspiracies, honestly, what I'm going to tell you looks much more like how real criminal organizations actually operate than any mystical world government ever could. If there is any kind of hidden power structure in this world, this is where you should really start looking. So, what actually is the mafia? The truth is, even the origin of the word mafia itself isn't completely clear. There's a popular theory that the word mafia is an acronym from an old Sicilian slogan, Morte alla Francia, Italia anela, which roughly translates as Death to France, Italy longs for freedom. According to this version, that's where the word mafia originally came from. For centuries, Sicily was ruled by foreign powers. The island passed from empire to empire, and its people constantly tried to break free. Over time, local resistance groups began to form, what we might call today national defense units or guerrilla fighters. In reality, these were groups of tough Sicilian men, somewhere between freedom fighters and criminals. They had structure, leaders, discipline, and they defended the island against occupying forces, including the French, who once controlled it. Historically, the word mafia only became internationally famous thanks to American organized crime, but its roots are purely Sicilian. The original Sicilian mafia is still officially called Cosa Nostra, which literally means our thing, and that name alone says more than it seems. How the mafia moved from Sicily to America. In the mid-1800s, during the unification of Italy, Sicilians began to be recruited into royal protection units. They were trusted with surveillance, enforcement, and what you might call dirty work. They weren't exactly private military contractors, but they were close. Legal muscle working for the Italian state. Members of the aristocracy openly interacted with mafia leaders, and nobody really considered it shameful at the time. At the same time, back in Sicily, those same groups were building real criminal empires. Smuggling came first, followed by corruption and protection payments. It wasn't racketeering in the modern sense. It was more like, pay us and we'll keep you safe. Farmers, shop owners, and craftsmen all paid into the system. The money wasn't huge at first, but the structure already existed. Strict discipline, a code of rules, and one absolute law above all others. Never speak about mafia business with outsiders. Not about deals, not about money, not about violence. Only inside the family. Italian immigration and the first mafia clans in the US. By the end of the 1800s, Italy's economy started to collapse, and millions of Italians looked to America as their only chance. Not just Sicilians came, Neapolitans, Calabrians, and many others crossed the ocean, hoping for a new life. They settled in New York, struggling to survive, but they didn't come alone. They brought their traditions, their codes, and their way of handling power with them. By the early 1900s, 2 major Italian criminal organizations were already operating in the city, the Sicilian Cosa Nostra and the Neapolitan Camorra. But before they could divide New York between themselves, they had to deal with the Irish gangs who were already there. If you've seen Gangs of New York, you've seen what that world looked like. Revolvers, street wars, and neighborhoods controlled one block at a time. The difference was that the Italians arrived with something the Irish didn't. A system, a hierarchy, a chain of command, boss, underboss, consigliere, enforcers, informants. And New York offered unlimited opportunity. Brothels, prostitution rings, illegal gambling, and smuggling networks. Through ruthless discipline and organization, the Italians slowly pushed the Irish aside and took control. And this was only the beginning. Why the Italians turned out stronger. So what exactly made the Italians stronger? What was their real advantage? Both Cosa Nostra and Camorra were not just groups of friends who came together to make money. They were family clans, real blood relations, brothers, nephews, cousins, second cousins, uncles, all tied together by blood, sometimes directly, sometimes through generations, but always within the same clan. And that one detail changed everything. When the police arrested them, nobody snitched. Interrogations turned into a joke. Gathering evidence was extremely difficult, and sending them to prison was even harder. Another key difference? The first major mafia scandal in the United States didn't even happen in New York. It happened in New Orleans, the second major destination for Italian immigrants after New York. In the late 1800s, the police chief of New Orleans, David Hennessy, went after the local Italians aggressively, and they didn't hesitate. They killed him. That assassination was the moment the word mafia exploded across America for the first time. Back in Italy, several major mafia organizations still exist to this day: Cosa Nostra, Camorra, 'Ndrangheta, and Sacra Corona Unita, each with its own structure, culture, and methods. But in the United States, all of them were called by one name: the Mafia. And from the murder in New Orleans onward, the Italians officially stepped onto the stage. They weren't afraid to shoot police officers. They protected their family ties at all costs, and they were incredibly difficult to destroy. By 1915 to 1917, while Russia was going through the Bolshevik Revolution, the United States was having its own kind of revolution inside the criminal world. The Italians had already pushed the Irish aside, and now two major clans, the Sicilians and the Neapolitans, were dividing Manhattan. They divided it with knives, assassinations, and shootouts. This was a real war between Cosa Nostra and Camorra. It lasted for a couple of years, and in the end, the Neapolitans were crushed, not only by the Sicilians, but also by the New York police. One of the arrested Camorra members eventually broke and started talking. He exposed the entire structure, and those who survived the war with the Sicilians were finished off by law enforcement. From that moment on, roughly from 1919, the Sicilians, in all their variations, began to dominate criminal America. America and Italy, one mafia for two countries. From this point on, we constantly have to switch between America and Italy, because the connection between them never disappeared. One part of the Italian underworld moved to the United States and built power there. The other stayed in Italy. Hitmen, bosses, and messengers traveled back and forth, from Europe to America and back again. New York belonged to the Sicilians. Cosa Nostra had won. But at the same time, in the 1920s, a completely different story was unfolding in Europe. Mussolini versus the Mafia. Italy was united, and a new regime came to power, the fascist government of Benito Mussolini. He was wildly popular. He had restored order, unified the country, and turned fascism into a national ideology. The police, the army, the entire state apparatus obeyed him. But there was a problem, and that problem was Sicily. There's a story, possibly legend, possibly true, that in the early 1920s, Mussolini visited Sicily and raised the issue of personal security. And one local Sicilian boss calmly told him, "Benito, you don't need guards. You are my guest here. You're under my protection." Mussolini smiled politely and said something like, "I appreciate that." Then he returned to Rome, or Milan, according to one version, and announced, "The Mafia must be destroyed. They are taking over the functions of the state." What does "you are under my protection" even mean? Who is this man to protect me? He's a criminal, and Mussolini declared war. From the early to mid-1920s, the Sicilian Mafia, Cosa Nostra, suffered devastating losses. Mafiosi were arrested in huge numbers. Fascists didn't bother with trials or fancy legal procedures. They simply beat people, locked them up, and broke families. They went after relatives, took families hostage, pressured wives, parents, children, until someone cracked and gave up a hiding place. Then they grabbed the mafioso. By the mid-1920s, the mafia had been hit hard, and many fled to the United States. Mussolini became a personal enemy of Cosa Nostra, one they would eventually take revenge on, and they would do it during World War II. But for now, it's still the 1920s, and we return to the United States. Prohibition, the moment the mafia became the mafia. Then something happened in America that turned the mafia into what we understand today, and instantly made it unbelievably rich. The United States introduced Prohibition, which lasted from 1920 to 1933. The idea sounded noble: make society sober, ban alcohol. But in reality, it failed completely. In New York State, prohibition was ignored about 95% of the time, and in California, more than 80%, which simply means people kept drinking exactly like before, only now they were doing it illegally. Underground bars exploded in number. Canadian whiskey, pure alcohol, even Russian vodka were smuggled into the country through the Great Lakes, across the sea, and over the Canadian border. Anything that burned, they brought in. Alcohol flowed into illegal casinos, betting rings, and secret clubs. America kept drinking, but now the mafia controlled everything. And this is where the legends stepped onto the stage. Lucky Luciano, Dutch Schultz, Meyer Lansky, and of course, Al Capone. Capone, the Chicago boss, is probably the most famous gangster in pop culture, but not even close to the most powerful, something that becomes obvious later. He was perfect for headlines, stylish, loud, obsessed with interviews and attention. First, he became a hero of tabloids, then, after his death, a movie legend. That familiar image, hat, coat, cigar, the boss of American crime. But none of that was really true. Capone grew up on the streets and became powerful only inside the Chicago syndicate, not across the entire mafia. Chicago was right near the Canadian border. Cross the lake and you're already in Canada, and from there flowed alcohol like a river. Capone turned it into a factory. And what did he really change? He corrupted the system completely. In Chicago, everyone was bought. Police chiefs, deputies, prosecutors, judges, lawyers, everyone. If you want a film that captures that atmosphere relatively honestly, watch The Untouchables. It shows how a special FBI unit was sent into Chicago, and they were called the Untouchables, because they weren't from Chicago and weren't soaked in local corruption, which was the only reason they could stand up to Capone at all. And in the end, Capone was never jailed for murder or bribery, but for tax evasion, one of the American justice system's favorite weapons, because tax crimes allow sentences anywhere from 5 to 25 years, depending on the amount. Capone died in prison, but by that point, he was already a legend, and the mafia had already turned into something massive. Every major city now had families controlling everything from brothels to gambling. But the real goldmine was bootlegging. Prohibition was a gold rush. People drank yesterday, they drank that day, and they would drink tomorrow. And if yesterday they paid 10 cents, today they paid 50. The white bone appears. The Jewish mafia and the brains of organized crime. Prohibition filled the mafia with insane amounts of cash, and money like that can't just sit in bags forever. It has to be moved, invested, cleaned, and turned into something legal. And at that exact moment, a new group enters the structure of American crime. Guys from the Jewish neighborhoods of New York, Meyer Lansky, Dutch Schultz, and Bugsy Siegel. These three brought a completely different mindset into the mafia. They brought accounting, strategy, and financial thinking. Because earning money is only half the game. The other half is learning how to keep it. It's not enough to make millions and hide them in a basement. Money has to be washed, invested, converted, legalized. At first, this problem wasn't as obvious because the IRS was not yet the monster it would become in the 1970s. But the danger was already clear. The mafia was sitting on mountains of black cash, with no clean system to deal with it. And that created the main conflict of the early 20th century. The Sicilian clans lived by old rules. Work only with family, only with Italians, no Jewish accountants, no non-Italian muscle. You did business only with your own kind. But the world had changed, and a powerful Jewish mafia appeared. Smart guys who understood taxes, investment, and real money mechanics. The old bosses, whom the younger generation sarcastically called Mustache Pete's, refused to adapt. They banned partnerships, banned Jewish associates, and banned joint business altogether. And the entire structure slowly began to rot from the inside. The younger generation was furious, and their informal leader became Lucky Luciano. Lucky was just a nickname, but everyone knew he was dangerous. And more importantly, he was friends with Meyer Lansky, a man he wasn't even supposed to be dealing with according to old mafia rules. Meanwhile, the Jewish mafia had already made huge money from alcohol and was growing fast. And the clash between tradition and modern thinking turned into an inevitable war. The Castellammarese War and the birth of the boss of bosses. In 1929, a war began that went down in history as the Castellammarese War, a brutal conflict between two Sicilian families, the clan of Joe Masseria and the clan of Salvatore Maranzano. Both were classic mustache Petes, old-school bosses dividing New York between themselves and, in reality, carving up all of criminal America. Prohibition had created insane wealth, but in 1933, it was repealed, and the river of easy money dried up. And when easy money disappears, war begins. What followed were assassinations, betrayals, Tommy gun massacres, car bombings, and executions, a true mafia civil war that lasted nearly 2 years. In 1931, it ended with Joe Masseria being killed, and Salvatore Maranzano becoming capo di tutti capi, the boss of bosses. From that moment on, the mafia resembled a formal empire. One Italian family per city, every city answered to New York. And New York itself had 5 families, because it was too big and too rich for one. But all of them ultimately answered to a single man. He decided who lived and died, who got promoted, which prosecutor disappeared, which police chief was removed, and where money went and where it came from. The mafia had become a centralized criminal corporation. Every family had a boss, a consigliere, an underboss, a treasurer, capos running crews, and soldiers who ruled the streets. And that structure, in its basic form, still exists today. Maranzano was the first official boss of bosses, but he didn't last. The conflict between the old generation and the new one never disappeared. The younger bosses understood the future meant Jewish partners, casinos, drugs, global money, and modern organization. The old men didn't, so Maranzano was set up. And the people closest to him, Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, Bugsy Siegel, and Meyer Lansky, arranged his execution. Maranzano was gunned down, and one man took the throne. Lucky Luciano, the true architect of American organized crime. Lucky Luciano and the Big Seven. Luciano inherited the empire and the title of boss of bosses, and immediately broke the old rules. One of his first decisions was to work openly with the Jewish mafia, instead of pretending they didn't exist. He created a structure journalists would later call the Big Seven, which officially consisted of the 5 New York Italian families, plus Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. Lansky became the brain behind everything, the sharpest financial mind in American crime. The group went big. They took over prostitution, illegal gambling, and casino investments. And this is when real money laundering appeared. Not just crime anymore, but a corporation. How money laundering works, and why it's called laundering. When people hear money laundering, it sounds complicated and dangerous, but the logic is simple. The mafia has massive dirty income from drugs, prostitution, illegal bets, and smuggling. But you can't exactly file a tax report that says, sold heroin. So the money is pushed through legal businesses and made to look like profit from cafes, bars, or service companies. The best businesses for this are ones with high traffic, cash payments, and fuzzy accounting. Restaurants, bars, pizzerias, laundromats. Imagine you own a chain of laundromats. In reality, you serve 100 customers a day. On paper, you report 500. Dirty cash becomes laundromat profit, or bar revenue. From the state's point of view, it's legal income. You pay taxes, and the money is now clean. That's exactly why it's called laundering. And historically, the first large-scale laundering operations really were laundromats. This entire system was perfected by Meyer Lansky, and it still works globally to this day. Murder Inc., the corporation of killing. The second system created by Luciano was Murder Inc., which newspapers called the Murder Corporation, led by Albert Anastasia. These people had only one job: contract killings. The mafia officially became a machine. Before that, it was clumsy and personal. We need Paul gone. Send Bert, he shoots well. Now there was a department. They planned hits, selected escape routes, prepared alibis, and worked methodically. Killing became a profession. One crew handled prostitution, another gambling, another underground bars, and one group existed for one purpose only: murder. By 1935, the leadership looked like this: Lucky Luciano as boss of bosses, Vito Genovese as underboss, and Frank Costello as consigliere. Mafia management at the highest level. Luciano was turning crime into a corporation. Anything inefficient simply disappeared, usually under a burst of Tommy gun fire. The fall of Luciano, the escape of Genovese, and the rise of Costello. In 1936, Lucky Luciano was arrested, sentenced, and sent to prison. Genovese became the shadow boss, but only for a year. In 1937, he was about to be charged with ordering a murder, so he ran to Italy. Frank Costello took power and would rule American crime through the 1950s. It was Costello who introduced a rule that would drive later generations crazy: no drugs. He considered drug trafficking ungodly and filthy and punished anyone who broke the rule. Meyer Lansky goes to Cuba and builds a gambling empire. In 1933, before Costello even took over, Meyer Lansky had already opened casinos in the US. And then he looked at the map and saw Cuba. At the time, Cuba was America's personal resort. Cheap, beautiful women, perfect weather, hotels, and nightclubs. And Lansky came in with casinos. One of his key bases was the Hotel Nacional de Cuba, which generated insane profits. Lansky built total corruption. Cuban officials were on his payroll, and the president himself, Fulgencio Batista, not only took a cut of casino profits, but extended his presidency after receiving a bribe of $250,000. It was a complete fusion of state power and crime. Cuba was effectively mafia territory. World War II. The mafia works for the US and against Mussolini. When World War II began, ports became critical. New York was full of mafia influence. Smuggling routes, cargo flows, illegal networks. German agents arrived, trying to sabotage shipments. And for the first time, the US government went directly to the mafia, specifically to Meyer Lansky. He was Jewish, a fanatic anti-fascist, had physically disrupted Nazi rallies in America for free, and was helping Jewish refugees escape Europe. Intelligence officers told him, "We have a problem at the ports." And Lansky replied, "No, you don't. You know Lucky Luciano. He's been in prison for 15 years. Let him out, and the problem disappears." And it did. The port stabilized, saboteurs were caught, and Luciano was released under one condition: leave America for good. He chose Italy. When the Allies landed in Sicily, mafia bosses helped choose landing zones and routes. Mussolini had crushed the mafia in the 1920s, and Sicily never forgot it. And behind all of it stood Luciano, already back in Europe, working against his personal enemy, Vito Genovese, a mafioso in the service of Mussolini, and then his enemies. At the same time, Vito Genovese is in Italy, and he is Sicilian, but instead of fighting Mussolini, he works with him. The regime gives him $200,000 for business, and he becomes involved in illegal supply schemes, medicine, equipment, and black market logistics. So you end up with a surreal contrast. One exiled mafioso, Lucky Luciano, is helping the Americans weaken Mussolini, while another, Genovese, is making money together with Mussolini. After the war, when Mussolini is literally hung upside down and trials begin, Genovese is on the verge of being labeled a fascist collaborator. How exactly he avoids serious punishment is still unclear, but by 1946, the picture is very specific. Vito Genovese is illegally selling military supplies, food, medicine, and surplus equipment from American Army warehouses. And on top of that, he has official letters from US quartermasters and from the Italian consul in New York, stating that he is involved in useful activity. Yesterday, he was serving Mussolini. Today, he's working for his enemies. That's classic mafia pragmatism. Wherever there is profit, that's where the truth is. French connection. Heroin goes global. Now let's look at what Lucky Luciano is doing in exile, because this is where the mafia business truly becomes international. Luciano builds what will later be called the French Connection, and the logic of it is simple. Raw opium comes from Southeast Asia and Turkey. Large processing labs that purify opium for the pharmaceutical industry are based in Marseille, and about 20% of the supply simply disappears. It is redirected, refined into heroin, shipped through the Corsican mafia straight into New York, and some of it stays in Europe. This pipeline runs from the 1930s all the way into the 1970s, almost 40 years. And this is the moment when organized crime becomes a global enterprise. The American side handles street distribution, the Sicilian Cosa Nostra controls logistics and wholesale flow, and the Corsican clans run Marseille and the production side. For the first time, the mafia is no longer just Italian or American, it is international. Casinos, Las Vegas, and the death of Bugsy Siegel. The war ends, it is now 1946, and the action returns to the United States, where the mafia opens its next gold mine after bootlegging: casinos. This chapter is inseparable from Meyer Lansky and his closest friend, the legendary Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy is Jewish, and his early money comes from being an enforcer and a hired killer. Then he makes serious cash during Prohibition, and in 1937, he is sent to California to control illegal horse race betting. The money is enormous, and he does well, crushing competitors and even eliminating a rival telegraph company that handled race results. At the same time, Hollywood is exploding, and Bugsy dives into the new world of celebrities, premieres, bright lights, constant attention, and endless affairs. One of them is Virginia Hill, and according to legend, the Flamingo Casino in Las Vegas is named after her. There is also a famous story that Bugsy once drove past Las Vegas and thought, why not build the American Monte Carlo right here? He goes to Lansky and says, "You're making money from casinos in Havana. Let's build one in America." Lansky negotiates with the Italian families. The money is approved, and in 1946-47, the Flamingo opens. But construction is expensive, the launch is delayed, and money keeps vanishing. Soon, the bosses hear rumors that Bugsy is stealing through fake contractors and skimming funds. In 1946, a legendary Mafia summit takes place in Havana, where Luciano is present. Lansky is there, senior bosses are there, and even Frank Sinatra shows up, a man who will spend his entire life denying ties to the mob. At that meeting, Bugsy Siegel is sentenced to death for one crime only: stealing from the Mafia. Lansky tries to save him, saying, "He's my friend. Yes, he stole, but give him a year and the casino will pay for everything. Killing him halfway makes no sense." Officially, Bugsy is given 1 year. 1 year later, when Flamingo finally starts making real money, Bugsy Siegel is shot through the window of his house, and all assets are immediately taken under full Mafia control. This is how the Mafia becomes the architect of Las Vegas, investing early and making a fortune in return. And after Prohibition, after Cuba, and after Las Vegas, the Mafia enters another golden age. Frank Costello, Psychoanalysis and Television. How a Boss Dug His Own Grave. Now it's the 1950s. Frank Costello is the boss of American organized crime. Lucky Luciano is in Italy. Vito Genovese is also in Italy for now. And Costello rules alone. 2 stories begin his downfall. The first one could be the plot of a movie like Analyze This, or a show like The Sopranos, because Costello starts suffering from panic attacks, severe stress, and fainting, and then does the unthinkable for an Italian mafioso of that era. He goes to a psychoanalyst. This is completely taboo, but he goes anyway. At some point, the therapist casually mentions to a journalist friend, "You won't believe who my client is, Frank Costello," and the information leaks. Costello cuts off the psychoanalyst, who surprisingly is not killed, but the damage is already done. Inside the Mafia, rumors spread. Our boss is losing it. Real men don't go to shrinks. Who does he think he is, a movie star or a woman? His reputation takes a serious hit. The second story is even worse. The 1950s is the golden age of television. The Mafia is no longer just in newspapers, but in front of the entire country, and the US Senate launches investigations into organized crime. Mobsters are arrested, hearings begin, and everything is broadcast live. Lawyers tell their clients not to go and to invoke the Fifth Amendment, but Frank Costello ignores them. He loves attention, cameras, headlines, and expensive suits. He appears at the hearings to prove he is just an honest businessman, but it turns into a disaster. He answers many questions with, "I don't remember," dodges others, and all of it happens live on television. Senior figures in the Mafia watch in disgust. First, their boss saw a therapist. Now he is arguing with senators on TV. This is not how a boss behaves. And while all of this is happening, Vito Genovese returns from Italy and wants his throne back. Costello refuses to step aside. Genovese starts plotting and eventually orders a hit. During the assassination attempt, Costello turns his head at the last moment. The bullet hits his jaw, and he survives. But after that, he steps down. And Vito Genovese becomes the new boss of bosses. The Apalachin meeting and the Great Failure. By this point, American organized crime was already fragmented. New York had 5 families, California had its own structure, Chicago had another, and places like Philadelphia, Boston, Montreal, and Toronto each had their own power players. The rigid vertical hierarchy that existed under Luciano was already gone. and Vito Genovese, driven by ego and ambition, wanted to bring the old order back. So in 1957, he decided to gather all the family bosses at a supposed conference in the town of Apalachin in upstate New York. The plan was simple. Everyone would show up, recognize him as capo di tutti capi, and he would officially reclaim the throne. Instead, it turned into a disaster. A local police officer noticed something strange. An unusual wave of luxury cars from New York, Chicago, and California. Every motel in the area suddenly booked, and suspiciously well-dressed men swarming around a rural property. He filed a report. The FBI got involved. And when the bosses finally arrived, the place was already surrounded. The meeting turned into a full-scale raid. Some were arrested on the spot. Others were chased through forests and fields. The Apalachin meeting destroyed Genovese's reputation, and in the end, it landed him in prison. Italy. Clans, heroin, and the First Sicilian War. Now we jump back to Italy, into the 1960s. The French connection is still running. Heroin continues to flow from Turkey and Southeast Asia into Marseille, and from there, through Sicilian and Corsican groups, into the US and across Europe. The money is massive, and sooner or later, that kind of money always leads to blood. In Palermo, the first mafia war breaks out, a war between Sicilian clans. The brutality is extreme. Families taken hostage, cars blown up, entire households wiped out. In just a couple of years, around 500 people are killed. Police respond with mass arrests. Around 1,500 people are detained across Sicily, mostly street soldiers and mid-level commanders. But instead of collapsing, Cosa Nostra actually becomes stronger. The war acts like a filter. By the early 1980s, Cosa Nostra effectively controls the entire heroin pipeline, the flow from Marseille to New York and across Europe. The 70s and 80s, cocaine, Colombia, and global money. Meanwhile, a new story begins in the United States. In the 1970s, cocaine enters America on a serious scale. In the 1920s, it had been a rich man's toy, then it almost disappeared. Now it returns with a vengeance. The Colombian cartels step onto the stage. A cocaine boom begins. Nightlife explodes. Consumption goes through the roof. And the American Mafia, naturally, wants a cut. The Gambino family takes control of part of the cocaine market. And this marks the second big wave of globalization in organized crime. Colombia manufactures the drug. It needs transport. Ships, planes, trucks. It needs corruption in the Coast Guard, police, customs. It needs street distributors, and that's handled by local gangs, Black and Latino crews. And once the money is on the street, it has to be collected, washed, and moved. That's where Panama, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and offshore zones come into play. And that's where Meyer Lansky enters again. He was the man who opened the first Swiss banking doors for organized crime. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Swiss banks end up under investigation for laundering money for American organized crime and Colombian cartels. The money moved through shell companies, fake names, and anonymous accounts. Hundreds of millions of dollars disappeared inside the system. Who Meyer Lansky really was. Now let's talk about Meyer Lansky. His real last name was Suhovliansky. He was born in Belarus, although he usually claimed Poland. He grew up on the streets of New York. That's where he met Lucky Luciano. There's a story that became legendary. Lansky is a small-time hustler. Luciano approaches him and says, "Listen, Jew, you'll pay me $10 a week for protection." Lansky refuses. Luciano and his crew beat him, take his money, and walk away. A week later, Lansky ambushes Luciano, smashes a rock into his head, empties his pockets, and says, "You call me that again and I'll cut your tongue out. You think only Italians know how to use knives?" From that day on, they become partners. Luciano becomes the muscle. Lansky becomes the brain. Lansky plays a huge role in bootlegging, pushing the mafia into gambling, building casinos in Cuba and Las Vegas, corrupting Batista, helping the Allied landing in Sicily, funding Jewish refugees during the war, and creating offshore financial systems. In the 1970s, when he's finally targeted seriously for tax crimes, contract killings, and illegal gambling, something unexpected turns up. He holds a long-term Israeli visa. He flies there. The FBI asks for his extradition, and the Israeli Prime Minister responds, "Meyer Lansky? A criminal? No, that's a philanthropist, a religious man, a donor, a supporter of Jewish causes. we're not sending him anywhere. He lives in Israel for 2 years. Eventually, he is sent back to the United States. His trial lasts 6 years, and in 1976, he is acquitted. The man who built the Mafia's entire financial system walks free. He dies at 81. According to rumors, he controlled around $300 million through shell accounts. In his own name, authorities find just $57,000. In real life, he looked like a quiet pensioner, walking his dog, no jewelry, no luxury, no flashy cars. Unlike many Italian bosses, he never showed wealth. But without him, the Mafia would never have become a financial empire. Unions and the Mafia. Who needed whom? The story of the American Mafia wouldn't be complete without the unions. Every time you watch a Mafia show, you see the same set: the construction workers' union, the truckers' union, the dock workers' union. There's a popular myth that poor workers were simply terrorized by mobsters who squeezed them dry. That's only half true. In reality, unions and the Mafia were mutually useful. Unions had what the Mafia didn't: mass, thousands of members. The ability to paralyze an entire industry with one strike. Take the truckers' union. If they declare a nationwide strike, companies will do anything to break it. And they bring in strike breakers, people who keep working while everyone else is on the picket line. The union can first try to talk to that guy. Come on, man, we're all striking. Don't cross the line. If that doesn't work, they go to the Mafia and say, "There's this driver who refuses to support us. He keeps rolling out onto the highway. Can you slash his tires? Maybe tune him up a little?" And the Mafia says, "No problem." In return, the union can push through a nice contract, direct shipping, or contracts to a friendly company controlled by the mob. Unions also had big funds, membership dues. Union leaders controlled that money and often invested it in semi-legal Mafia projects in exchange for kickbacks and political support. The Mafia helped union bosses become politicians, expand into other industries, build influence. When a union leader started thinking he was completely independent and didn't need the Mafia anymore, he could simply disappear. But overall, from the 1950s to this day, part of the American Union movement and organized crime lived in a tight symbiosis. Italy in the 70s and 80s, triumph and counterattack. In Italy, the 1980s were a time of triumph for organized crime. The Mafia had infiltrated everything: big corporations, oil companies, railways, ministries, the police, the prosecutor's office. Italian groups were tightly plugged into international networks. The 70s and 80s were the absolute peak of their power. At the same time, another major war was unfolding in Sicily. The Corleonese clan, from the town of Corleone, launched a brutal battle against the rest of Cosa Nostra. It was a war of ambushes, kidnappings, assassinated prosecutors, bombed trains. Out of Cosa Nostra grew a new structure, the Stida, the star in Sicilian, hence the star tattoos. These were young, more aggressive clans who wanted their own share and joined the war. Mass shootings, bombings, and random civilian deaths shocked Italian society. The government literally sent army special units into Sicily. The Mafia responded with even more terror, bombed trains like the Naples-Rome line, murdered prosecutors and generals, attacked judges. By the 1990s, this all climaxed in an operation called Mani Pulite, Clean Hands, led in Milan by prosecutor Antonio Di Pietro. Over 10 years, about 2,500 people ended up on trial. Businessmen, officials, mayors, police, journalists, judges. The entire country turned out to be entangled in Mafia ties. 4 major political parties simply disappeared because their leaders were neck-deep in corruption and Mafia deals. Out of this chaos rose a new political player, Silvio Berlusconi and his party Forza Italia. Cynics said he went into politics to protect his own business from the prosecutors because his brother, in reality Paolo, was already in serious trouble. At first, Berlusconi publicly praised clean hands, saying Italy had to purge itself. But once he became prime minister, he turned on Di Pietro, and the system turned on the prosecutors. They tried to smear Di Pietro himself, accused him of corruption, and gradually the campaign was wound down. Even so, thousands of officials, bankers, and Mafia bosses did end up behind bars, and the Mafia suffered a massive blow. Clean Hands is still studied today as one of the clearest examples of what happens when a state really decides to fight organized crime. The US, RICO, Giuliani, and the fall of the boss of bosses. In the United States, a similar turning point came a bit earlier, in the 1970s and 80s, and it was tied to the future mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani. He was Italian himself and said, "Right now, every Italian in America is automatically associated with the mafia. I'm going to prove that the mafia can be destroyed." The main weapon was the RICO Act, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Before RICO, law enforcement would catch the shooter, give him 10 or 15 years, and that was it. With RICO, prosecutors could pull the thread upward, show that a murder was committed on orders, and charge not just the triggerman, but the boss as part of a criminal organization. Giuliani and the FBI aggressively used wiretaps in social clubs, restaurants, and homes. That's how they captured the voice of John Gotti, the new boss of bosses from the Gambino family. Gotti was a showman, expensive suits, flashy women, he loved interviews. One of his famous lines was, "I don't really need much from life, just a good tuna sandwich." On the tapes that would later be played in court, he also says, "I am Cosa Nostra, and I'll always be Cosa Nostra. Bring this guy to me. If he doesn't come, tell him I'll kill him because he disrespected me." After those recordings and the application of RICO, John Gotti got life in prison. Even behind bars, he tried to act like a boss, but eventually died of throat cancer. By that time, Italian organized crime in the US had taken a serious hit. Some families were decapitated, many bosses were imprisoned, and their influence was no longer what it used to be. But power never stays vacant for long. Onto the stage stepped the Latin American cartels, Mexican drug groups, black street gangs, Mara Salvatrucha, and others. The criminal world became even more mobile and international. New players brought new tools. Cryptocurrencies, complex global money routes, and offshore havens spread all over the world. The modern mafia, from the US to Australia. Today, the structure that was born in the 1930s still exists in the United States. In every major city, there is an Italian family, and in New York, there are 5. Genovese, Colombo, Bonanno, Lucchese, and Gambino. The Gambino era ruled roughly from the 1960s through the 1990s. The mafia is no longer as visibly powerful as it once was, but it still controls a significant part of organized crime in America. In Italy, things look similar in principle. Cosa Nostra in Sicily, Camorra in Naples, 'Ndrangheta in Calabria, and Sacra Corona Unita in Apulia. Camorra controls construction, waste disposal, drugs, prostitution, and human trafficking. Large numbers of illegal migrants from China arrive in Italian ports, literally inside shipping containers, and are then distributed across the country under criminal control. 'Ndrangheta today controls most of the cocaine coming into Europe. It's not a strict vertical hierarchy, but a network of families organized like a federation, with a temporary leader, capo crimine, chosen through traditional rituals. Many experts believe 'Ndrangheta is currently one of the richest and most dangerous criminal organizations in the world. Sacra Corona Unita is the smallest of the 4, mostly focused on smuggling, prostitution, cigarettes, and migrants from the Balkans. The social role of the mafia, and why some people defend it. During the COVID crisis in southern Italy, Naples, Bari, and further south, where poverty is widespread, jobs are scarce, and people were literally left without money, journalists reported that it was Camorra that handed out food, gave cash to the poor, and supported struggling families. Bosses openly said, "The government, as always, abandoned the South, but we're locals, we take care of our own." And that's part of the problem. The mafia both exploits the region and plays a social role at the same time. By tradition, a Camorra boss is supposed to live in a poor neighborhood, not in a villa on a hill, so he doesn't lose touch with the streets. And when police raid Camorra areas, locals throw trash at officers, hide fugitives, and see the mafia as their people rather than the state. Rituals, Omertà, and the immortality of the mafia. Mafia rituals still exist today. Omertà, the law of silence, means you never talk about family business with outsiders. Initiation involves holding a picture of a saint while it burns in your hand as you swear loyalty. If I betray, may I burn in hell. There is blood, ritual words, and an oath of vengeance. Betray your own, and you will be hunted down no matter where you hide. TV shows like Gomorrah or 000 portray this fairly realistically. And yes, there were and still are journalists like Roberto Saviano, the author of Gomorrah, who drank with mobsters, collected their stories, then published books without permission, and now live under permanent police protection because forgiveness is not part of that world. The Mafia is immortal. The Mafia is no longer just Italy and America. It operates in Australia, where 'Ndrangheta clans control parts of the drug trade and agricultural markets, in Canada, in the UK, in Latin America, and through partnerships with Russian, Ukrainian, Balkan, and Asian groups. It works with the Yakuza in Japan, with triads in China, and with Colombian and Mexican cartels. When people talk about a world government, a huge portion of real decisions about drugs, weapons, migrants, and dirty money is made by these networks. Through shell companies, they own parts of legitimate businesses, control transport flows, and influence financial markets. Every week you see headlines like 120 kilos of cocaine seized at the border, or 1 ton of drugs confiscated. And if 1 ton is caught, it often means 10 tons got through, not inside couriers' stomachs, but in containers, airplanes, and trucks. So, no matter what the next law is called, no matter which new prosecutor steps on stage, as long as there is massive dirty money, demand for drugs, prostitution, and gambling, and a state willing to outsource parts of its monopoly on violence, the Mafia isn't going anywhere. It changes its shape, its passports, its names, but the system itself remains.